Hi, everybody. It's John Corelli, Average Guy Opinions. Here's part two of Martin Luther King Day, Malcolm. I have a little more knowledge on Malcolm X than I do Martin Luther King. Mainly, he just fascinated me more than Martin Luther King did. Um, Obviously, had a very different path to the civil rights movement than Martin Luther King did. As we know, Martin was a preacher and a scholar and a student of nonviolent social change. Malcolm got there in a very different path. I highly recommend, if you can't read his book, his autobiography that was written by the late great Alex Haley, who also wrote Roots. You at least see the movie. The movie's 3.5 hours long, but I would say it is Spike Lee's masterpiece. I honestly, I'm biased because I'm a big Malcolm X fan, but it's a really well done movie. 3.5 hours is a lot, but hey, we live in a time where you can stop it, go get a burger, do whatever you need to get through the movie. But I can sit through that movie no problem. It's an amazing film. So, um, let's talk about Malcolm. How did he get there? How was his life versus Martin's? I mean, like I said, I didn't know a lot about Martin's childhood. I know he's the son of a preacher and started off at the Ebenezer Baptist Church. He also, honestly, obviously, like I said before, took the scholarly route, and then from the Montgomery bus boycotts until his assassination in 1968, was obviously the face of the civil rights movement in the 60s. So, Malcolm, different. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little. He was born in Nebraska. His family did okay because like Martin, Malcolm's father was also a preacher, but Malcolm's father was a preacher of a different ilk. He was a back to Africa preacher, which the practice of what was called Garveyism. Marcus Garvey was a back to Africa preacher and did very well. And I think he came up mostly in the 20s. And uh, so excuse me. So Malcolm's father did the same thing. Preacher in Nebraska, back to Africa preacher. The family was often harassed. And this always struck me as odd. It's like, if you're a white racist and don't want black people around, why would you give the back to Africa preacher a hard time? Doesn't make sense to me. Um, I would think, oh yeah, I'm all for that. Yeah, I'll give you here's some money. I'll come and put something in the collection plate. I want you out of here. It doesn't make sense that they were harassed so much. Um, their house was set on fire. Windows were broken all the time. They really had a hard time in Nebraska. And finally, Malcolm X's dad was murdered. Of course, the insurance company, um, the white-owned and frankly racist insurance company, because they had a policy on Malcolm X's father, said he committed suicide by bashing his own head with a hammer and then laying himself on some trolley tracks. Sure. So, what comes about after that? Malcolm's family has a very hard time. His mother is struggling to feed six children. She eventually kind of snaps and ends up in a sanitarium, and the children that are not old enough to go out on their own are parceled out to the state. Malcolm is a very intelligent child. He does actually pretty well in that system, but he does not as well as he can because he's not white. Because despite wanting to become a lawyer, his teachers tell him, "You can be a carpenter. You will work with your hands just because you are simply because you're black." Um, that that doesn't sit well with him. He deals with it, but he moves on. I believe he graduates or is thrown out of school. I can't remember which. Ends up in Detroit for a while. Starts just struggling and doing what he can to survive, which means crime. He gets in trouble in Detroit. Gets down to Harlem, and then really understands what it's like to be a black person in New York City. He also gets better at crime, meets better criminals, and runs numbers for a while. He gets starts getting into cat burglary, and then he ends up in prison for 8 years. That was back in the 50s. And this is where his life changes, and this is why I find him so amazing. Very few of us could hit the lows that he hit and hit the highs that he hit. This is Malcolm X, if nothing else, is a treatise on the human spirit and how one can change himself. So I'm always amazed with what this man was able to accomplish, considering what his hardships were. He discovers Islam in prison, does things incredibly even in prison. He starts questioning the Christian missionary, or not missionary, the Christian priest or pastor in church. He debates. He reads the dictionary from cover to cover to improve his vocabulary and his intelligence. He kind of gains that intelligence back that he had when he was a young man, and those smarts that were used on the street are obviously smart too, but now he's using them in a more, I guess, shall we say, productive way. He finally gets out. He meets the Elijah Muhammad. Elijah Muhammad uses him as a mouthpiece for the Nation of Islam because he's an amazing speaker and an intelligent debater, and also very good in an interview for the most part. I mean, we've all heard, many of us have heard about the chickens coming home to roost after Kennedy was shot. Basically said the white man's violence finally caught up with him on one of their own. Really, Elijah Muhammad was not happy with this. Understandably so, it did not make them look good. However, Malcolm was real. If nothing else, Malcolm was real. What else can we say? Uh, I find the man fascinating. Like I said, he so he for a couple of years he is basically the main mouthpiece of the Nation of Islam. After he feels abandoned by Elijah Muhammad, he is silenced after the chickens come home to roost quote or speech, as it was called. But he decides I'm going to go on a pilgrimage. He goes to Mecca. He goes to Egypt. He because the Nation of Islam is also like Garveyism was at that time in the '60s, a separatist movement. It was we've got to have our own thing, but we're going to try to have it here in America because it doesn't make sense for us to move all the way back. Our roots are here, our homes are here, but we got to find a way to do our own thing because white people they don't really want us. They don't want to integrate. So that was the Nation of Islam's message. So when Malcolm got kicked out or silenced actually by Elijah Muhammad, it was like 100 days or something. I can't remember. But he goes, well, I'm going to make the best of this time, and I'm going to go to Mecca and Egypt and see other Muslims and what they're about and learn even more than I've already learned. And he does. He sees, so he goes on that pilgrimage and he sees Muslims of every color. And he sees love of Islam where people, the only thing they have in common is Islam and that they're Muslims, and he sees that love and he understands that, that love doesn't necessarily have to come through religion, that we can probably all get together somehow. So he comes back and he branches off from the Nation of Islam and starts I believe it was called the OOAU, the Organization of African Unity or something like that. And so he starts that, and this is where all the theories come into what led to his assassination in 1965. I mentioned in part one how I had been to places that were important to Martin's life, like the Ebenezer Baptist Church where he preached, and I don't know if I mentioned it, but I've also been to the Center for Nonviolent Social Change, and I've also been to the Audubon Theater where Malcolm X was shot in Harlem. So I've been lucky to see these places. As a person who has a degree in history, it's a big deal for me to go get to see these places. It gives me chills. But so that's what happened to Malcolm. Malcolm started to branch out. He was killed in February of 1965 at the Audubon Theater while or preparing for a speech. There are theories that the CIA or FBI were behind it. These are fair theories. We don't know, but it ended an amazing life. And then a few years later, on April 4th, 1968, of course, Martin Luther King was shot in Memphis, Tennessee, on a hotel balcony. So this is part two. This is the culmination of two amazing men's lives that that were the faces of the civil rights movement in the 60s. I was born in the 60s. Part three will be me. We got Martin, Malcolm, and then next part will be me. What have I done? What can I do? What can you do? Average Guy Opinions. Thank you. Peace. Hopefully see you for part three. Bye.